Well, welcome to Black History Conversations. We have Black History Conversations in all sorts of interesting places. And I'm delighted to say that we've got Trey here with us today. And I'm going to introduce him properly in a moment. All right, okay. I'm Liz Millman from Learning Links International. I think you might be able to tell that it's pretty cold here in North Wales at the moment. We're getting on in September, and I have to say my woolly hat's a necessity. And I do apologise that I'm presenting, if you like, if I'm welcoming Trey, and I'm here parked in Porth Penrhyn in Bangor. So you can see a few historical buildings by me. These are the places where the Penrhyn family shipped their slate out over the years and all around the empire. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we can introduce Tre Ventour Griffiths. Now, Trey and I have just been having a little conversation to get going, and more of Trey's work can be found on his website, which is Tre Ventour, um, TreVentour.com, with a fascinating film that you've produced earlier in the year, which we're going to be talking about now. So I think, Trey, I'm going to stop sharing with that. And I'm going to say it's brilliant to be able to talk to you in person. We've been planning this for quite a while. So thanks, Trey. Let me hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
Um,
Okay, then.
can I share my screen?
Yes, certainly. I'm not sure if let's do the things that are needed to share the
I
screen.
think I'm.
Can you do it? Oh, yes,
Yeah.
that's lovely. Thank you. Brilliant.
Uh,
Okay, then. So over to you, Trey. And I'm just really interested to hear your story, and we'll share this widely with folks who join Black History Conversations from time to time. We've not got a big turnout with the session today, but quality, that's the answer.
mhm.
Okay, over to you
um,
then.
well, thanks a lot for inviting me to speak today. I know you and Elizabeth have been trying to get me for a while, so I'm glad that I've got time to do it now. So this talk is a summary of my PhD research on Caribbean Northamptonshire between 1948 and 1990. And for those of you that don't know, Northamptonshire or Northants is a county in England um, within the East Midlands, sorry. And I look at how I got into my PhD, some of my research methods, and also the progress I've made with it, and also some of the opportunities I've got out of my recent, I guess, academic life, and also some other projects. Um, so I'm going to begin with my PhD's abstract, so summary. So written published works about post-war Caribbean communities have in large centered on major cities, including London, Birmingham, and Bristol. This research centers on my home county, Northamptonshire, in the East Midlands, to center popular focuses on cities through the production of a new work of creative non-fiction based on oral history testimonies. Though many Caribbean people moved to British cities from the 50s onwards, these are not the only places that have a post-war experience or Caribbean history. So my thesis positions Northamptonshire as one of these sites of Caribbean settlement from as early as 1948, including the first generation of children that were both of Britain and the Caribbean that followed as well. So my PhD is a creative writing PhD, not a history one, almost written entirely based on oral history testimonies to articulate some of what happened in my area between 1948 and 1990. So a creative writing PhD is very different to other types of thesis. So my thesis is 50,000 words worth of stories, followed by a 30,000 words discussion of the research that I did, including my reflections on things that happened in my research period. So things like interviewing people and even going to local events and things like that. Although the title claims I start from 1948, I do give a bit of background to who was here during the war, as I also found out that Black American servicemen and GIs were stationed locally too. as Caribbean people were not the first Black community in Northampton during the 20th century. So, in that way of thinking, I talk about the Black Americans on the local military bases and the parties I was told about that happened there, which is likely what happened when the US Air Force took control of RAF Croughton in 1950, which is right on the Northamptonshire Oxfordshire border, in the same way that RAF Grafton Underwood was given to the Americans in 1942, and this base was just north of Kettering, in the north of the county. I'm told Black Americans were stationed locally, but have yet to pin down the specifics as well within that. What I do know is on Tuesday, the 31st of August, 1943, a detachment of 150 Black American troops marched down Gold Street in Kettering, which I found in a book called Fred Moore's Kettering by local historian Tony Smith. There's also a video from October that year, and there are further mentions of Black Americans in the local paper, the Kettering Leader. I know if I look for it, I will find it, especially with reports of Wellingborough as well. I was told Black GIs were living at what is now called the Victoria Centre, while in Northampton, Black servicemen, not just GIs, could often be found well into the 1950s, in fights with the police outside of clubs like the Mitre, which is now near the new bus station. And these fights were probably due to racism too. So Black Americans did predate the Caribbean presence, and then the Caribbean people came, and those very different Black cultural groups mixed. And of course, white British people were there too, Indians and other minoritized white groups like Irish, Polish, Serbians came here as well. And I'm not the first to do this kind of research either, following previous work done going back to the 1980s with Julia Bush and Alan Howard's Moving On project, and up to the present day as well. So my family came to Northampton in the late 50s, early 60s from Grenada, and it was here these stories of growing up, that was one of the inspirations for my project. So family history threw me into community history. The stories I heard about local families going to each other's houses, christenings, parties, weddings, functions, and some such. It's something I articulated see articulated in British films and TV programs, but it focuses on the inner city London experience. So, being a creative writing thesis, I was then able to take inspiration from other kinds of sources. And for me, that was feature films and genre television, actually about Irish Italians, and Jews moving into the United States. So, for example, everything from um, Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets to things like The Godfather and later Once Upon a Time in America, um, Goodfellas, Bronx Tale, and into the 21st century with Tom Hardy playing the craze and legend set in the communal East End. So very much the family-orientated nature of many true crime stories. So I took the essence of family from this true crime narrative and stamped it on the story I wanted to tell. I also came into contact with Colm Tolbin's book, Brooklyn, which shows how Irish communities developed in 1950s New York, and also Amazon's The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which does similar with the Jewish diaspora too, following the Holocaust. It's actually not seeing myself in literature that led to me criticizing the London-centric nature of post-war, so-called Windrush literature. In fact, I came to see people like my family and the experiences of many people I interviewed more related to in British films of the 50s and 60s that shows Caribbean or Black people living around the white working class, especially in the East Ends of London, for example. So things like The Pool of London or Sheila Delaney's Taste of Honey, which is actually set, I think, in Salford in the 50s, and also Roy Ward Baker's Sapphire, not the more famous, I guess, Black British films from the 70s onwards, like Pressure, Babylon, and Burning an Illusion, or more recently, Small Axe. So the communal living presented in the 50s and 60s film context uh, seemed a bit more uh, seemed a bit more provincial in its approach than the grittier later films, and those stories were not being told by Black filmmakers. So you're one of the mill period dramas that get labelled as so-called white shows. So things like Grantchester, set in rural 50s Cambridgeshire, where a priest helps the police solve crimes. And there are plenty of Black and Asian characters in that show as well, in guest roles. And the guest roles in those sorts of programs are often more interesting than the main roles as well. Um, and so those that sort of geographical aesthetic of the countryside is something I saw told back to me by people I interviewed about Northampton and Wellingborough during the early 50s and the 1960s, when there were fewer cars on the road, there was just less built up. Um, so at the start of my project, I planned on only doing 40 to 50 interviews, but I ended up doing actually 124. So there's hours of data to deal with alongside photographs, various documents people gave me from their personal collections of what they held onto from back then. Alongside the interviews, I found many more things on microfilm at Northampton Central Library, as well as using local history groups on Facebook, which are their own archive of memories too. So visiting the news archive where the microfilm is, I looked for mentions of black folks sitting there for hours. And then going to the records office with June Elizabeth, that was a completely different experience altogether, as people like June Elizabeth had done some of the intentional work of archiving Black history. So if you want to know about Windrush in Northampton, a lot of those interviews were done earlier and it's archived too. So I don't have to sit there looking for hours as I did in the library, but in the records office where things are more organized, it was just brought to you. So what do all these people have in common who I interviewed? There were 124 potential threads of inquiry, not binding people together, and 124 sets of experiences. So that took me to historian Philippa Langley's Missing Princes project, something that to onlookers may seem completely outside of my subject area or even interest, but whose method of doing a cold case, princes that were allegedly killed by Richard III, was remarkably apt for I was investigating, especially when thinking about doing research on people that are in some cases not here to tell the story as they've died. Similarly, the documentary The Princes in the Tower, the new evidence, criminal barrister Rob Rinder questions his own emotional sensibilities. And he says, I have to acknowledge that I learned my history in England, and Richard III is the bad king. He killed the boys, so called. I'm aware of that. So every time I'm looking at a document, the most important thing I have to do is step back and imagine I know none of it. That's so essential. But the reality is that that's really hard. It's a difficult thing to not bring your own bias to a document. So thinking about my own positionality, um, researching community I've grown up in, I had to question whether it would be so terrible to impose my own emotions on that history. But due to this being a creative writing project and not a history one or even a sociology one, I was not just making a history document, but something that allowed us to reanimate the past, a bit like a corpse in that sense. For example, I was able to play around with sites like the old Citadel, which was squatted by the young Rastafarians in the 70s to use as a youth centre. Since hauntology, there is how elements of a social or cultural past haunt the present. It disrupts the present day conversations of the past as a straightforward progression of time from point A to point B. So hauntology allowed me to ask those social questions about the demolition of the citadel as a metaphorical murder of a whole community, especially of the young people. When I was also told the council sent in bulldozers in the middle of the night, one night in 1995. The barren land that once housed the citadel shows how the state commits murder and nobody ever sees the murder weapon. So history is written by the conquerors, not the conquered, and hauntology is one creative discipline and technique that is useful in thinking how black spaces demolished by the white institutions give us give up the ghost in the present, including continued preoccupations by the British state and academia with the history of the victor's narrative. Historian Hanina Ramirez further says Henry VII did a very good job of getting rid of documents of Richard III's reign, of rewriting accounts, of having documents disposed of, and is writing his version of history, and it's the one we have inherited. So much in the same light, it does feel that Northampton's institutions, like the police and the council, sometimes feign shock when we remind them of how long the Black presence in Northampton and the county goes. And in some ways, these institutions were one of the local community's biggest adversaries. If I was doing a history thesis, arguments that historians um, that historians make about lack of evidence would be applied to the fact my project is being done pretty much entirely based on eyewitness accounts. However, such criticisms may well be knocked back when oral history is legitimate, especially in African and Indigenous contexts, and the onus for sources to be verified by externals is how the colonizing gaze silences Black history as well. Um, so Black histories that have been erased too. In that light, those interviews began with local community figures like June Elizabeth and also Marcia Walker. So it was last February, Marcia turned up at my house with a plastic wallet full of contacts and told me that I needed to write to these people. So I did. And later, it must have been in April last year, that June Elizabeth um, gave me a similar list of people um, um, via email, specifically in the context of Rastafarian, the MFM people. And she had asked them prior, so I interviewed quite a number of those people too. So between them, they had facilitated at least, I guess, between 20 and 30 of the people I interviewed. Um, when many people I talked to then snowballed into other interviews. So other people I got from existing networks. So over the course of 124 conversations and the way they spiraled into each other, I began to think about journalism and films as a way to think through my interviews. So, for example, the 1977 film All the President's Men, based on the book by Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. How journalists run a case was not so different to what I was doing, talking to people, asking questions, taking an interest, and then researching around their comments, and in some cases, finding news clips based on what people said in interviews. Certain trends presented themselves, including the types of work people were doing, for example, nursing, seamstress, um, factory labor, cleaning, as well. Yet the biggest trend was how people or remembered Northamptonshire back then, or Northampton and Wellingborough, um, as if they were sort of like big villages. So much in that same trend of journalism films, the way people talked to me about Northampton and Wellingborough looked to Tom McCarthy's Spotlight, which is based on a book called Betrayal, the Crisis, and the Catholic Church, set in Boston. So, like Boston, my hometown shows how even big towns and cities can become smaller depending on your position within them. So, like that film, my research choices were dependent on believing eyewitness first and foremost. However, unlike those journalists, most of what I was being told could not be officially verified because I was dependent on what had been recorded to some extent. And and at the time, not everything was photographed or documented properly. So a lot happened behind closed doors and little rooms. So white journalists operating in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, in large, did not always see black people as journalistically interesting, unless those stories in some ways infringed on the lives of white people. In academia, we call this phenomena interest convergence, which was a term first coined by Derek Bell in 1980. Um, uh, for example, so stories about black youngsters who squatted the Citadel in the 70s, which was a building claimed by the council, which is a white institution and still is, who then weaponized the police against these young people. So I can use these very creative ways of thinking to better suit how my brain works, because I also think in images. So films and TV shows and documentaries and photographs are much more useful for me than say journal articles, for example. I'm not against journal articles, but it's just how I learn things effectively. Um, these films help me recognize in new ways that history and stories in general are everywhere. Here I began to think about sociologists like Christina Sharp and what she calls Black redaction from her book In the Wake, and that she describes as seeing and reading otherwise towards reading and seeing something in the excess of what's caught in the frame. And what she's saying there is that Black life can exist in places even where we least expect it. And this idea is what I applied to my own methods as well. Um, Literary critic as well, Corinne Fowler's book, Our Island Story, uses walking to tell a colonial history of Britain and the British rural countryside. And in that way, you can think about walking or traveling as a research method and even understanding the world we live in, which I only saw later that traveling was like that for me. Not only did my interviews take me to other parts of Northampton and Wellingborough that I was unfamiliar with, but I also went to Kettering and Longbuckby as well, also wider to Banbury on the Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire border, Bedford, St Albans, Wolverhampton, London, and Newcastle too. So I was researching Northamptonshire, but it really took me across the country to get interviews done. I didn't want to do my interviews online, as the virtual world extracts that personalness, I think. So the talks I've done on my PhD have also taken me to universities in Oxford, Liverpool, York, Coventry, Glasgow, and many others. So these are conferences that I've presented at. Um, I walked or I took the bus to local interviews, and it allowed me to explore local places and spaces I hadn't done fully. So creative writing can help fill in those historical silences, which Sadia Hartman, in her essay, Venus in Two Acts, as critical fabulation. And more of those things, and one more of those things was using horror inspirations to talk about the ghost buildings, spaces, and places like the Citadel being demolished, and what remains there instead, and what has replaced them. Um, in that similar light, um, the 2023 film Occupied City by Steve McQueen, a documentary based on his wife, historian Bianca Sticker's book, Atlas of an Occupied City, Amsterdam, 1940 to 45, shows how racism and political self-interest can dictate how properties and geographies attached to specific communities get earmarked for demolition by a more powerful entity. So in that case of 40s Amsterdam, Dutch Jews were victims of the Nazis. So McQueen, linking the ghosts of the past to the present day sites, many of them demolished, via film, illustrates what could be possible if I were to ever take my PhD and just give it to a film producer, effectively, or if I took the original work done by Northampton Black History Association, what would that look like as a theatre piece or a film piece, as an example? Where am I? Oh yeah, Melanie Hyam's calm narration takes viewers through day-to-day Amsterdam and Nazi rule. So the film's continuous acknowledgement of demolition is useful to me in thinking how this is in a way what happened to Northampton, our buildings, and how new histories get built on top of the old ones, bulldozed and forgotten. And that film's questions make me think about what Black British hauntology could look like in current conversations about Black British history, and what sites and histories have never been, and what sites and histories have been devoured to maintain white superiority, institutionalized racism, so to speak. So you've had a bit about my PhD and some about the creative horror elements and the ghosts and how that can be used to bring history into the present. And now I'm going to talk about how the stories about racism got me to think of new ways to think about it. I was told everything from microaggressions to being beaten up by the police, National Front, etc., and also down to things like name calling. These stories across several decades, combined with what I have been learning about racism today, following the George Floyd protests in 2020, allowed me to produce a new thread of work using popular culture, mainly ideas located in science fiction, to think about social justice differently. So in 2018, in 2018 film Avengers: Infinity War, there's a quote that says, "At the dawn of time, at the dawn of the universe, there was nothing. Then boom, the Big Bang sent in six elemental crystals hurling across the virgin universe. These Infinity Stones each control an essential aspect of existence: space, reality, power, soul, mind, and time." But prior in early 2023, before I did any interviews, I was thinking about how science fiction metaphors can be used to talk about what academics have discussed for years, particularly the points made about the different terrains, um, the different terrains racism can operate on. Although many scholars have written about racism across several dimensions, so racism as multidimensional, they're not accessible to a regular person on the road. So I began to think about Marvel comics and science fiction more broadly, and the Infinity Stones, and how these might be a way to get people to think differently about how we approach that subject. Um, for the systems of domination that academics talk about more in more academic ways, might be thought more simply through six ways, like the Infinity Stones. So last November, I wrote an article thinking about how Marvel deals with reality and used the world of Ant-Man, which operates on a subatomic level. So the world of subatomic comes from physics to mean existing at the level of protons, neutrons, and electrons, so smaller than an atom. And I asked, what if we thought about the effects of racism that way? So many people I talked to referred to the racism they experienced as not racism at all, but name calling and prejudice. So everything from not being able to get jobs to being denied entry to hairdressers, pubs, and clubs, and so forth. So their experiences tied with my own and many of my colleagues and friends in academia, part of that deep background of work that underpinned a paper I did for Kingston. Um, I think that was in December 23, and that was called "Honey, I Shrunk Racism: Whiteness and the Subatomic Dimension," which was later reduced from 1 hour to 15 minutes for a conference in York, rewritten as "Microaggressions Disassembled: What Connects Marvel's Ant-Man and British Misogynoir." And I used the experiences of Diane Abbott earlier on this year when she was victimised by the Conservative Party's biggest donor, Frank Hester. So this work on microaggressions and the reality stone became part of a broader project that takes each stone and builds narrative around how each one might be thought about as a metaphor for the different ways that microaggressions, but also generally racism at large, operate. And that takes so what Hartman calls critical fabulation, and using creative methods to fill in silences, you could use that for science fiction as well. So I basically brought science fiction into disciplines like whiteness studies and black studies, etc., etc. Um, I was basically using Infinity Stones first introduced to the comics in '93 as what we call pedagogy, so how people learn. Um, so I was thinking about a multiverse of white supremacy, where people like myself are impacted by racism as spiritual violence, as much as racism alters the ways people perceive time and reality, just like the ways the Infinity Stones impact people in the films and the comics. A project that started as just interesting began to be a serious activity, now including one lecture, three conference papers, and one long form article. Now with papers on how broadly discrimination can be discussed via reality, space, time, and the spirit, so the soul. I think lots of these extended metaphors can be applied historically, i.e., in the context of Windrush, etc., etc. Um, Books like Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure influenced lots of my early work in what he describes as the silly archive, where we can just use seemingly nonsense texts like comics and children's films to make us imagine different, including how Marvel allowed me to see the real world of infinite possibilities through fiction. And that came from queer theory, so queer studies as well. That work on Marvel joins my other work I'm doing on popular culture. So earlier on this year, I published a chapter on whiteness in a book about Netflix's TV show Bridgerton, and I'm now working on another chapter for a book coming out hopefully by the end of next year called Jane Austen and the Making of Regency Whiteness, edited by Kerry Sinanan and Desha Osborne. I think Desha's at Edinburgh and Kerry is out in um, Winnipeg in Canada. And they're both historians of Jane Austen and the 19th century. Um, Last year, I was part of a poetry anthology as well on Black British history, which was led by George the Poet, further to doing a chapter on COVID-19 and racism in the context of British honours. So colonial honours, MBEs, OBEs, the establishment, all of that stuff. Um, and I wrote that chapter during my master's course which was 2020. So it was that summer it was the George Floyd protest summer, basically, when I wrote that chapter. And it only came to light last year. I've also written about my experiences of disability and doing get invited to talk about that too. So my work in it's in lots of different niches. As far as PhD progress, I've completed a first draft, 10 chapters with a total of 90,000 words, including references, with a split of 6 chapters for the creative writing section. So all the history and stories around Northamptonshire, against the 4 other chapters, which is basically what research I did and my reflections on that research. My thesis is not just a history. It's not just history. I further drawn on my journalism background, writing for a general audience, because I want non-academics to get it as well. All the presentations relating to my PhD are now on YouTube, I'm sure. I think most of them are there now. And I've started putting some of the bits I've done on comic media there too, and in writing. And hopefully that's the end of my talk. Hopefully I've not gone on for too long. And thanks very much for listening as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, just amazing. I'm sorry, I've got the sunshine behind me. Right, just amazing your work. It's
Yeah.
so detailed and such interesting ways to share it. Absolutely fantastic. So it's good that we've got June Elizabeth joining us, who's been one of your lead people,
Mhm.
and we've also got Vivian Crawford joining us from Jamaica. So I don't know if it's possible to see you, Vivian. That's lovely. Vivian, I was explaining it's really cold here, so hence I've got my woolly hat on. And June Elizabeth looks well rugged up as well. So Trey, absolutely amazing. So going right back to what you were talking about initially, you were talking about the Black American troops.
Yeah.
Um, that's a fascination to me because I was brought up in a little village in Worcestershire. And there were 2 army camps in the village before my time. I was born post-war. And one of the army camps was a black GI camp, and one was a white GI camp. And yet we can find out nothing about it.
Mm.
And yet these must have been some of um, I mean, we know there were lots of black people here in the UK over the years, but those war stories, how interesting that you picked that up as well.
Yeah. I think with the military, when it came up in conversation,
Yeah,
um, when I was asking about what their experiences were when they first came to the UK, and they said the first black people that they saw were Black American soldiers. Um,
yeah,
and this was right. This is not just near the war either. This is well into the 60s as well.
yeah, yeah.
And a couple of the people I interviewed were children of Black American servicemen and local white women too. So,
Yes.
and they told me how they'd grown up in the Caribbean community and going to blues parties and things like that. So that side of the history. Then I found certain newspaper articles telling me about um, the presence of black servicemen, um, and I found one for Northampton, um, and the one from Kettering I'll be looking for. So the Tony Smith's book was really helpful for that because he's referenced the Kettering one. So I just had to go and find the clip. But there'll be plenty of stuff like that in the news archives. It's just finding time to do it. Um, yeah.
Well, fascinating. But so many things to follow up there. And interesting as well that you talk about, having looked at family history, that you've then moved on to looking at local history and you have um the position to look back
Mhm.
and to look at your grandparents, presumably, possibly great grandparents. Was it your
Yeah, I interviewed my grandparents for the project for my PhD, and
Yeah.
quite a number of my family members, um, and they gave me the whole family history of how we came to be here from Grenada,
Mm,
um, and that was interesting as well because we came from the countryside in Grenada, where everybody was farming land and things like that, and then to come to the UK and then been doing jobs that are to the anti of that. Um, must have been
Yes,
like the adjustments must have been huge when they
yes.
first did that in the 60s.
I think that's perhaps not always been taken account of, and the fact that people came with amazing agricultural skills, and we never took any advantage of that, it seems, in the UK.
Yeah.
That the farming community was very much a white community, and the skilled agricultural workers who were coming in from the Caribbean and Africa perhaps were
Mhm.
never
Yeah.
never acknowledged. So quite amazing. So how many interviews did you say you did in the
Oh
end?
gosh.
I've written down
Uh,
140,
124 interviews.
124.
Um,
Absolutely amazing. Yeah, quite incredible. But there are so many stories there, and as you say, perhaps poignantly, um, you've got stories recorded for people who are no longer with us.
yeah.
And I think that's, really very significant indeed. Now, you also talked about black spaces being destroyed by the establishment.
Hmm.
Um, and again, that resonates with things that happened in my experience in Wolverhampton and also in Dudley, interestingly. So, yeah, very poignant stories, really, and difficult. So that was fascinating for me to hear. But I better let other people get a word in edgeways. So we've got June Elizabeth and we've got Vivian Crawford, Dr. Vivian Crawford joining us. So maybe we'll ask our guest from Jamaica first, June Elizabeth. June Elizabeth's traveling at the moment.
I,
So
I
Vivian,
I yield to June, please. She's from Jamaica.
oh, she's from Jamaica, yes, but you're
Yes,
actually
yes.
in
I
Jamaica
speak
at the
up to
moment.
June. Yes,
I'm
yes.
in Wales. June Elizabeth's on the M1, I think, sitting in the back of the car. Vivian, you caught in on the end of some of Trey's presentation. Have you got any questions you wanted to ask him or
Well,
points to raise?
yes. First of all, to thank him most sincerely for the presentation. And it's fortuitous that he's doing this presentation because my sociology lecturer at the University of the West Indies um, was a Grenadian scholar, Hermione Mackenzie. And she taught me sociology. She and her husband, they both went to London University. They were scholars from their countries. Their husband was from Guyana. And I am so indebted to them. I'm so indebted to them. My continuing regret, and based on this stunning presentation this morning, why is it that information about the colonies, enslaved colonies, we have to go to the UK to get the information, and the cost is unforgivable? Why?
Yeah,
Why? Why do we have to pay so much to get the research material? Is there anybody who can answer that question?
I don't know, but it's a really important one. Trey, have you got any comments about that?
um, I'd say that's a legacy of empire. For me, anyway, I'd say that's probably legacy of the British Empire and colonialism, and how it's like how colonialism wasn't just physical, it was intellectual and spiritual and as well. So they make you go into empire to learn about it, and generally only people that live there can afford it. So then, yeah, so that's basically how empire still lives in the present day. Um, and what I would say also about the access, even for students that are in the UK studying this, um, it's inaccessible for us as well to some extent. You have to play the game in UK academia even to get access to sources that are useful for your research. And even then, if you don't if you don't look the right way or think the right way like them, they won't let you in. And I felt this with my masters because I did my MA thesis on the 1919 uprisings um, after the First World War, and also some of the stuff that happened afterwards between the wars. And I went looking for the Muriel Fletcher report which happened in 1930, and that report was about her basically stigmatizing the mixed race children of black veterans and local white women in Liverpool. And I went to go and look for it at a university in Manchester, and I was just like, it's just told to go away because like you're not wanted here, basically. And that's what can happen if you're in UK academia and you don't know the right people. It's all nepotism, and yeah, I think that's what I want to say about it, because it's all empire and nepotism. So it's hard for scholars in the global south to access to it. But if you don't operate in the right way, even if you're in the global north, you won't get access either. So it's like the 1% of the 1% basically get access.
Who is the Wilberforce fighting for us?
Pardon? Say that again.
Who are the
We live in Vivian, the line's breaking up, but I think you were saying that, who's fighting for this?
What?
No,
Can you say again, Liz?
I think what Vivian was asking was, who is fighting for this? And the point that I would make is that at the moment, with a exciting project we're working on, where we've got a number of opportunities for Welsh people to go to Jamaica and Jamaican people to come back to us. It's easy. We don't have to get a visa to go to Jamaica. White people or people with a British passport who might not be white, but anyway, who have got a British passport. But the hoops that our Jamaican colleagues are having to jump through to get the necessary visas to come to the mother country is just remarkable. So I can totally understand Vivian's comment.
Yeah.
Vivian, how's your line now?
Yeah, I'm asking, is there any Granville Sharp? Anyone with the DNA of Granville Sharp or William Wilberforce? Or are we left on the ocean drifting? We will never know what we are supposed to know.
I mean, there's lots of academics fighting for that, and
thank God.
There is lots in the academy fighting for it. But at the same time, it can be disheartening because when you're fighting, there are other people gatekeeping at the same time. So, and one of the biggest places where that sort of extraction happens is in academic publishing, and access to journal. Even so, you want to read a journal article, and they want to charge you £85 to get access to the paper, for example. And even the author doesn't get paid to write the paper generally. So you've got these journals making huge sums of money, and the authors don't get paid for it generally. So where's all the money going? So that's
it's a certain real concern, isn't it? I know we were trying to do some research on a brilliant individual called Robert Rumble in Jamaica, and I've sent an email with a plea to a colleague in Jamaica. Please, can you try and get the information, because we can't get it out of the system. It's locked into these academic vaults, which is disappointing. Gosh, so right, June Elizabeth, let's see if you've got any comments now. I know you've been mentioned several times by Tre, and I know you've been a great supporter of his and Wonder Woman when it comes to Northampton Association.
Well, all I got to say is that I love listening to Tre's presentations, and Tre, you don't mind telling us how old you are? Are you 25?
No, I'm 28 years old. 29.
28.
In 29 November. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
You're older than me.
Come on, stop blagging you.
with Tre now, right? If anybody's got anything and they wanted a presenter, Tre's, I put him on top level. Yeah, I'm proud of him. Yeah, for his age group and how he goes about it. you know. He's very meticulous, and he doesn't stop. You know what I mean? I've still got some homework for you, Trey, what you gave me to do. Do you know Petra's coming over?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to get that information from Joanne about her mum in the restaurant. Yeah. And what I liked what Trey had said is that every time we interview different people, they've got their networks. And you was able to, you with me?
Mm.
And also when Liz said that some of the people are not with us now, well, it was his anniversary last week. Suleiman.
Yeah.
Well, the 12th of now, Suleiman is a Jamaican, a very clever man. He married a white lady, right, Liz, who is my best friend. She's very clever as well. They live in London, and he passed away last year. But it was maybe about 3 weeks before that Trey went and interviewed, wasn't it, Trey?
Yeah, yeah.
It was a shock when I told you he'd passed, didn't it?
Yeah.
And he was the main man who came from London and ran the first self-help black Matafantanka, self-help group in England,
Yeah.
in Northampton. Yeah. So when Trey said I took him to the archive, this what happened? It was quite funny, really, because they were saying Trey wasn't sure if we're going to pay to do the printing, innit, Trey? He wanted some printing. Well, you do have to pay. So, she said, I'll have to go and find out. And then, the lady that she found out from, I told her that most of the things in the archive, I was responsible for putting them there in the first place. So she said, oh, no, we won't be charging Trey. You know what I mean? And what I found out when Trey was talking about, in a nutshell, unless we write our own history, it can be written in a different way. We all know that. Dr. Vivian always talks about that as well. But what I found when I went in the archive, say for example, there would be a picture of Dr. Vivian then, and they said it was Trey. He was me. I said, that ain't Norris Cohen. So I've got to go to the archive and edit some of the history that they put pictures to somebody who's working there. I don't know how it came about, because when we first deposited in the archive, maybe, can you remember how long ago that was, Trey? Maybe about 20 years?
Yeah, 2002, I think.
Right. Yeah, about just over 20 years ago. Not many people in England were doing oral history. So therefore, we done about 200. So what I directed the director who we paid good wages of the association to where the archivists and the people who are doing the interviews, we trained them to go. So we went to the churches, and we went to the elderly, went to young people who maybe not got much life left, and wanted people in the archive a good 60% are no longer with us. And to close, there's a book, I don't know if you had mentioned it, Craig, Trey, called Cold Arrival. And what they did, I think I mentioned it to Liz before. What they did, they've done a history on all the people at the elderly centre who wanted to partake. And Olive passed away, don't you, Trey?
Yeah.
Well, at her funeral, Steve Stevenson was facilitating, and he was talking about Cold Arrival. And then I said to him, there's only one person left alive in that book. I said, Trey, because I took you to a house.
Yeah.
97-year-old Jamaican lady. Yeah, and she was
Yeah.
armed, robbed. Remember I told you, Liz, some burglars came into her bedroom 2 days before Christmas. You know, the key outside, what the doctors and nurses come in, they took us something and took it off like a crowbar, and they took the key out and came into her room. But
That's terrible.
her son had just died. Yeah, her son had just died. That's who I'm talking about. The same lady, the man that was in charge of the movements, and he married to a white lady who's my friend. Well, his mum is the only person left in that book called Cold Rifle.
That's
Her
just
title.
amazing. I mean, the work that you've done, June Elizabeth, over the years is just truly, truly amazing. So we're going to wrap up now, June Elizabeth. I know it's difficult for you with travelling, and Trey, we really, really appreciate the help and the offering that you've shared with us today. Your work is just fascinating, and I'm sure we're going to hear more and more about the sort of work that you've been doing. And I'm intrigued to know with the links that you're looking at with Bridgerton and Jane Austen as well. Just such a wide range. So, round of applause from Dr. Vivian Crawford in Kingston, Jamaica, and we're really, really delighted. So I'm just, if that is that okay, Trey?
Yeah.
I'm
Just thanks for inviting me.
Oh, good. I'm just going to tell folks what we're doing. If I can find the right place, of course, which I can't. Excuse me one moment. I was just going to try and share my screen. So,
Yeah, so where about in Wales are you? In Bangor?
yes, I'm in
Oh,
Bangor.
right, okay.
Right, okay then. So let me just point how you do this then. Because I need to get back to my screen. Oh dear, I'm making a bit of a mess of this then. Well, just to tell you then that next week we've got a very special session because it's the 150th Black History Conversations session, and that starts our Black History celebration. So we're delighted that Professor Catherine Hall is joining us, who's Catherine Hall, widow of Professor Stuart Hall, but in her own right, a person who's had a fascination and studied so much about the history, particularly of the plantations and the enslaved workforces there. So Catherine's going to share with us something about our story here in North Wales of Penrhyn Castle and the Pennant family. And I'm sitting parked today in the Porth Penrhyn, which is where the slate went out to all around the empire, and those slate quarries were purchased and with funds that were generated from the plantations in Jamaica. So that'll be a really, really interesting session. So we look forward to that. Then the next week, we've got Beverly joining us to talk about African lives, a walk around Newcastle. So I think the point you made, Trey, about people, taking a walk, literally getting out and about, it's really important. And the week after that, the 18th of October, we're on to welcoming Dr. Barrington Richardson, the Director of Education in Clarendon. He's coming to North Wales, and he's going to join us and tell us about what he's learning about our history, but also what he's going to be taking back to Jamaica, that he's finding out about our schools and how we're integrating, talking about learning about Black history. The week after that, we've got Joan Grant from London talking about Black people in London. W10 and W11 from 1870 to 1970. So we've got a good lot there of local history that we're looking at. And then as we move on to November, we've got a couple of sessions where we'll be live from Jamaica and back from Jamaica and reflecting. So lots of exciting things coming up on Black History Conversations. So I'm just going back to my Zoom screen, which I can't find at the moment. So I'll just see. Yeah, there we are. Magic works sometimes. Okay, so anything more from you, Dr. Vivian Crawford? It's good to see you again. So unmute yourself, please. Unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. Yes, to say thank you so much, Liz. We thank you. We're eternally grateful to you for facilitating these sessions. And we call them the Liz Millman Institute, Tre, because we benefit from them so much. Thank you very, very much. I'm sorry I have to leave now for another matter of state.
All right. Well, we're all leaving now, so thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you very much, Trey. You can't have a Liz Millman Institute without excellent speakers and presenters, and you've shared with us so much today. So we'll be posting this recording, and thank you very much indeed, June Elizabeth, for joining us as well, and Simon for setting all this up. And then he has to dash out of the office and leave us to it. So I'm now going to try and end the recording and with
Excuse me, Liz.
all of you.
Would you be able
Yes.
to send the link so that Trey will be able to go back when it's put on there for him to go back and share it?
Of
Yes.
course.
Okay. Lovely.
All right.
And thank you very much, Trey. I'll be in touch with you. And Dr. Vivian, you remember what you said one time, but you might not remember now. I'll send it in a WhatsApp and then I will tune into you. All right then. Take it easy.
Okay.
Look
All right.
after yourself, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
Thanks so
Okay.
much, Trey. Really, really appreciated your time today. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
All the best,
Excellent.
everyone. Bye
Yeah.
then.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. One love. Bye. Should I tell you something?
Oops, daisy. All right. Well, we're just trying to stop the recording here unsuccessfully. Bye then. We'll see if we can stop this. Right, okay, all the best then, everybody. Bye.